What are the root causes of the crisis in Ukraine? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled case for the libertarian philosophy within the context of the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined as I am every week by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics, libertarian extraordinaire at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, and to be with our viewers and listeners as always. I'm glad they can spend a little time with us.
Yeah, good to have you all back. If you're brand new, come and visit us at fff.org. Subscribe to our free FFF Daily, which is, well, we'd like to think it's the best libertarian commentary page on the internet. So, Richard, one of the burning issues of the day is what's going on in Ukraine. So I thought we ought to devote some time to it. And so I'll start out as we do every week. I'll give you my perspective on what's going on, and then I'll throw the baton over to you. The thing that strikes me the most about this crisis is that if this old Cold War dinosaur NATO had gone out of existence at the end of the Cold War, or from my perspective, preferably if it had never been brought into existence, this whole crisis wouldn't have happened. Now, the defenders of the U.S. government are saying, well, Ukraine's an independent country. It has the right to join alliances and so forth. And from a straight technical standpoint, they're right. But the fact is, we live in the real world. And in the real world, there is no way that Russia is going to permit U.S. missiles and tanks and bases and troops to be stationed along its borders any more than the U.S. would be willing to let Russian troops, tanks, missiles be based on the Mexican border, the Mexican-U.S. border, much less 90 miles away in Cuba. We all know what the result would be if Russia were to do that. That's just the real world. So at the end of the Cold War, if NATO had gone out of existence, there would be no concern in Russia with respect to the U.S. basing its missiles and tanks and so forth in Ukraine. It's the fact that NATO continued moving east after the ostensible end of the Cold War, gobbling up former Warsaw Pact countries, gobbling up the Balkan countries, and then ultimately with the aim of absorbing Ukraine, which would then entitle the U.S. to base its missiles, tanks, and troops and bases right along Russia's borders. So it's really the perfect racket, as far as I'm concerned, for how the Pentagon can incite these crises and then say, oh, well, look at the aggression, which was really their whole strategy during the whole Cold War. There's another dimension here, is that, as you know, the United States is required under NATO's rules to come to the defense of any NATO country that is under attack. And notice something important here, that Congress plays no role in this. So here, and you've got conscription in this country. I mean, you don't have the conscription taking place right now, but that's what the draft registration is all about. Conscription is a standby power, that if the U.S. gets in a major war, the Pentagon claims the authority to draft young men and young women as well, seize them out of their homes and their businesses and their regular lives and send them over to a training camp, military training camp, become employees of the U.S. government, and then sent away to fight and die for so-called freedom. Congress plays no role in this. That here's really the Pentagon's calling the shots in this whole thing. The Pentagon decides it wants Ukraine as a member of NATO. That requires now the U.S. to come to the defense of NATO, along with all these other little third-rate, third world countries and so forth, that is really pledging the lives of the American people. I mean, I don't understand why any parent who has a child between 17 or grandchildren between 17 and 24, say, isn't standing up and opposing this type of thing, because it's an automatic thing. If Russia were to attack Ukraine, Ukraine's a member of NATO, the U.S. has to come to defense of NATO under their rules. I mean, you're talking about nuclear war here, and even if cooler heads prevail and keep it as a conventional war, you can be darn sure that children, people from 17 to 24, so are going to be drafted. So why didn't Congress have a role in this and making this decision? Those are the elected representatives of the people. So again, my take on this is that you've got the U.S. national security establishment that wants to maintain its predominant position within the U.S. government and is looking for official enemies, looking for crises, looking for anything it can to justify ever increasing taxpayer largesse funding this racket. It's really the continuation of the Cold War racket. I mean, the Soviet Union unilaterally declared an end to the Cold War, but I don't think the U.S. government ever ended the Cold War. That's what this is all about. That's what the trade war against Red China is all about. It's what the embargo against Cuba is all about. The hostile relationship with North Korea is all about. The Cold War was their big gravy train. And when they ostensibly lost it, they went into the Middle East and incited terrorist attacks. And then we got the war on terrorism, and that keeps going on. So now it's their ideal world. They got crises with Russia, with China, with terrorism. And of course, you got Congress funding the Pentagon, the CIA in ever increasing ways. So my take on this is just abolish NATO. It's a Cold War dinosaur, get rid of it and establish America as the leader of moving this world to a peaceful, harmonious place. What do you think?
Well, of course, to go to your point about Congress and NATO, the fact is Congress has approved this. The Congress did approve through an act American founding and participation in the NATO organization. What they have done is that they then delegate that authority to those in the executive branch to determine when and how our obligations need to be fulfilled. Of course, Congress still authorizes funding, and that would involve extra funding. So Congress has that subordinate role, but they've already given their approval. They basically have said it's up to the White House in conjunction with the Joint Chiefs of Staff to determine how best to respond to what is viewed as an actual attack on one of the member nations. This is no different at one level, let me suggest, Jacob, than the Congress establishing domestic regulatory agencies and delegating an immense amount of implementation policies to these regulatory agencies. What will be approved? What will be prohibited? What benchmark standards and rules must private sector enterprises, businesses, and corporations meet without Congress having any say or participation in what it is for, the rationales behind it, or the negative consequences for private sector producers and ultimately the consumers who otherwise would be buying freer, competitively marketed products. So basically what we've had both domestically and internationally, foreign affairs, for a long time, is Congress basically setting aside its own place in these matters concerning legislation and responsibility and decision-making by just basically passing it on, deferring to the executive branch and the regulatory agencies. And in foreign affairs, this means basically the commander-in-chief, the president, and those in the military establishment upon whom the president relies and jointly decides what is to be done, often based upon their advice or not. But the consequence of this is that Congress basically signed off on this a very long time ago, back in, what was it, 1949 it was, when NATO came into existence. So this is a long precedent. Now, of course, you could say fortunately, there was never an immediate confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union in Europe, where a war seemed to be imminent or actually being begun, where NATO would have had to kick in during those decades of the Cold War. But the same thing would have happened then, Jacob. Congress would have deferred because it had authorized the treaty and the rules under which the treaty operates for the president and the Pentagon to decide these things. So this is what is going on now has been built into the NATO structure for the United States from the very beginning. Now, you are right as well, if I can add to that, that if NATO was established by the United States under the rationale and the reasoning that the Soviet Union, and at that time, of course, led by the dictator Joseph Stalin, was an imminent threat to countries viewed as part of the security of the United States, right or wrong, that was the rationale. Stalin had gobbled up the countries of Eastern Europe, basically under the rationale of his interpretation of the Yalta Conference agreements from the end of the Second World War, and that he seemed to be hungry for the rest of Europe, and that in a weakened state after the destruction of the Second World War, it behooved the United States to save the West from communist conquest. Well, whatever the reasonableness or not, as you were suggesting, of the rationale, the reasoning, the necessity, and the policy implementation through those decades, the fact is the justification for NATO basically disappeared with the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union collapsed. The countries were behind what were called the Iron Curtain, the captive nations of Eastern Europe, were freed. They established and have more or less had sort of admittedly corrupt and hypocritical, but variations on democratic governments for the most part. They have chosen to integrate themselves economically into the European Union. And the Soviet Union is now very far away because of the breakup of the Soviet Union and its republic constituencies. Russia is now very far away geographically from the heart of Europe compared to the height of the Cold War, when it had troops in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. So the justification for it, that the world was facing an imminent communist conquest, has long passed. Does Russia still have nuclear weapons? Yes. Does it have a conventional military force, much larger and potentially intimidating in relation to its weaker neighbors, most of whom now, of course, are former Soviet republics just because of the geography of it? But the fact is, there is no reason for NATO anymore, other than the fact is, again, you were suggesting, Jacob, is that how do you justify the Pentagon's budgetary rice bowl? The fact is that the United States government spends around $750, $800 billion a year, not very far from $1 trillion a year, I suppose, if you included all the slush funds and CIA costs and other things, close to $1 trillion a year. Not only does this support the power structure in the Pentagon itself, the hierarchy of the military establishment to maintain their positions, their opportunities for promotion and advancement, but think of all the contractors who derive their income from this nearly $1 trillion annual defense budget. The builders of submarines, the builders of aircraft carriers, the builders of military planes, tanks, artillery, regular armaments, ammunition, the uniforms, just go on. This is a huge feeding trough for significant segments of the American corporate world. And they, in conjunction with the bureaucrats, and the Pentagon is a bureaucracy, they, in conjunction with the bureaucrats of the military establishment, have a very strong interest to do anything and everything in their power to maintain the justifications and the rationales and the presumptions of threats and dangers upon which their gravy train or rice bowl or trough continues to exist and potentially would get larger.
Yeah, no, you make a good point about Congress having approved originally the NATO concept. My point is this, and you alluded to this, is this delegation, this supposed delegation of authority to add members. That the original idea behind NATO was to protect Western Europe from a Soviet attack. That was the intent. Everybody understands that's the intent. At the end of the Cold War, the NATO bureaucrats, principally the US officials who run NATO, they're really the ones in charge. They say, oh, well, we're now entitled to go beyond this mission that NATO was formed for and that Congress approved. we're now going to protect Eastern Europe from any kind of attack. Well, I would consider that illegitimate because it was clearly not the intent of Congress to do that when they formed NATO. And that what they're essentially doing is they're pledging to the United States to go automatically to war in the defense of these countries. And as far as I'm concerned, that when their provision is going to call for automatic war, Congress ought to play a role in this. In other words, that if let's say Poland was attacked and it wasn't a part of NATO, and the president said, well, I want to come to the defense of Poland, he would have to go under our form of government. He'd have to go to Congress and get a declaration of war against the attacking nation. There would be a debate. There would be discussions. American parents could weigh in, send letters to their congressman and say, hey, we don't want to go to war in defense of Poland. This is not something that we want to pledge the lives of our children for, our young people. But the way they've got this thing set up now, they're gobbling up all these new members, and that there's no congressional role for that at all. It's automatic. As soon as that nation comes under attack, whether it's Red China or any other nation, they come under attack, the U.S. is automatically obligated. That's what I'm saying is illegitimate. I think that before the U.S. goes to war and before they have these NATO provisions that obligate the U.S. to go automatically to war, Congress ought to make the call and say, well, do we want to automatically go to war in the event Poland is attacked or Latvia is attacked or whoever is attacked? I think that it's obligatory for the Congress to play a role in that because they're the elected representatives of the American people. I think your point about this racket of, virtually $1 trillion being funneled into the military and the CIA is so right on. It's incredible, Richard. I mean, look, after 20 years of warfare in Afghanistan, Congress has just appropriated more money to the Pentagon than they've ever allocated in the past. They gave them more money than they were even asking for. How is this possible? They don't have the bombs that they're using up in Afghanistan, the missiles, the bullets, all the electricity and stuff to run the bases there. I mean, ordinarily, wouldn't you think, just logically speaking, their expenditures would have dropped? But the Pentagon is very, very powerful. I consider the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA the most powerful part of the federal government. Eisenhower, in his farewell address, referred to it as the military-industrial complex. But in an earlier draft of his speech, he referred to it as the military-industrial congressional complex because of the tremendous influence and power that the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA have over Congress. I mean, they will not buck. You'd very rarely find any member of Congress that's going to buck the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA. They know what would happen. That immediately the Pentagon would threaten to close some military installations in that particular congressional district or that particular state. The mainstream press would go on the warpath and say that's an ineffective member of Congress. We need to get rid of him. And that guy would be history. And so you've got this situation where Eisenhower was right. It's this complex that is virtually impossible to break. And in the meantime, they're breaking us financially because we see there's $30 trillion in debt now. The Federal Reserve is inflating the money supply. There was no tomorrow. And nobody's willing to give up his dole. I mean, we know that Social Security and Medicare recipients are not going to give up their dole. And darn sure the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA are not going to give up their dole. And let me add another dimension of this. I'm just finishing a great book called Base Nation. I highly recommend people to read it. It's incredible. It goes into all these foreign military bases. It's the best analysis of these foreign military bases that I've read. And it follows up on Chalmers Johnson's great book on, I think it was called An Empire of Bases or something like that. Johnson's, he's deceased now, but he had the best understanding of U.S. imperial foreign policy than any analyst around. And I highly recommend people to read his books, Chalmers Johnson. And if you want to read some of his articles, just Google Chalmers Johnson before you buy any books. They're fantastic. But Johnson had written a book on this empire of bases that the U.S. runs overseas. And it really is an empire. They essentially control matters within all these countries where they have these bases. Well, this guy, David Vine, wrote this book called Base Nation that, I mean, he just takes the cover off these bases. They're horror stories, Richard. They not only are they have tons of money that are flooding in to build them, support them. They have like beautiful resort type conditions for the generals and the colonels and so forth. And then PX privileges, not only for the soldiers, but for well-placed people within the country, the citizens of the foreign country, the government officials, in order to keep them happy. And then you've got around the bases forming brothels and houses of ill repute, bars and so forth. You've got a massive rape situation where U.S. troops are raping people that are domestic citizens of the host country. You've got corruption going on. I mean, they've tried to audit the Pentagon on the expenditures in these bases, and nothing ever comes out right, and nobody ever does anything about it. It is just this hotbed of corruption in these bases. And then you've got also all the pollution that takes place in these bases, not only with fluids corrupting the earth the around there, but also with respect to all the ordnance, the bombs, the missiles, and you've got the well-heeled people there, the local contractors that help build these things. They're happy, but most of the citizens around these bases are terribly unhappy. So you get this anti-American animus going on. When you add all this up, it's amazing that the American people just continue to act so nonchalant, so passive, deferential to the U.S. national security establishment, when in fact they are doing so much damage to our country.
Well, I think I want to sort of mention one other point of what we were talking about earlier, and then I want to pick up on what you just said. One is that you're pointing out that Congress has, in a sense, abridged its own constitutional authority in the case of a NATO conflict. But Jacob, that's true with every national defense treaty we have with any other country. What if China were to attack Japan? We have a defense treaty with Japan. As I understand it, the same as under NATO, the United States would be required to immediately come to the military assistance and support of Japan to fend off and to repulse a Chinese attack. Any country with whom we have such a military treaty of mutual defense is a situation parallel to the one that you're expressing a concern and a dubiousness about concerning the NATO relationship. So in fact, this is a web of mutual defense treaties that the United States has with countries around the world outside of the NATO structure itself. That is what makes us an empire. That is, our soldiers through these bases are at the ramparts around the world to hold off what at various times during the last 70 years have been considered the barbarians at the gate. And the barbarians change depending upon the political landscape. But there's the fact that through this network, we envelop the planet. When people in Washington, D.C. say that some situation somewhere in the world is essential for the United States government to take seriously because it involves the national interest, given these web of bases, the mutual defense treaties, the economic and political either formal or informal alliances between the U.S. and virtually dozens upon dozens upon dozens of countries around the world, what could happen anywhere on this planet that could not be said to be in the national defense interest of the United States, to which the U.S. government has to respond? Where? I suppose that if the little country of Andorra between France and Spain in the Pyrenees Mountain decided to aggress against Spain, that would be viewed maybe not in the U.S. national interest. But unless you had a bizarre example like that, there is nothing in the world that, as far as the people in Washington are concerned, is not part of our national interest. And that is what is particularly dangerous about these things. The other element that you're talking about, why aren't the American people upset or irate or respond to this? But what do they know about these things, Jacob? Does the mainstream media do any expose articles about the existence and the structure and the spillover effects of these bases in other countries to inform the American public? Do they do exposés on the waste and inefficiencies of a good part of that almost $1 trillion a year that the Pentagon and the related defense agencies spent? No, they're basically, whether it's Republican or Democrat, they're basically cheerleaders for this idea of global internationalism that has guided American foreign policy since Franklin Roosevelt into Harry Truman and after that. Because, you know, in spite of the fact that Eisenhower made those warnings in his farewell address, let us keep in mind that in 1954, he was considering dropping atomic bombs on the communist forces in French Indochina to support the French, that is in Vietnam. And in fact, it was only Lyndon Johnson who persuaded him that he would not have congressional support because French Indochina did not fall into some type of treaty ambit, which would necessarily suck the United States into that conflict. So the situation, every president, even those who have been concerned about these affairs that you're saying, participated in these things. It was in the 1950s while Eisenhower was president that a left-wing government in Guatemala was overthrown. So we should not forget the fact that even those people who have occupied the White House, like Eisenhower, who had doubts and hesitations about this, were no less a part of this entire process and institutional structure. But the American people don't know about these things. You're mentioning a couple of books. I would be surprised, even among our viewers and listeners, you know, the dozens, I mean the thousands who watch us. I wish it was tens of thousands. Even among those who very kindly listen in to our weekly shows, I would doubt whether very many of them have even known the titles of the couple of books that you mentioned today relating to these American bases around the globe. So it's ignorance and misunderstanding or lack of even knowledge of what is going on, what it entails, and the dangers that could occur from that.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's why FFF exists, and that's why people fund us. That people have their ordinary lives, they have their businesses to run, they have families to raise, and they oftentimes don't have the time to do what you and I specialize in. And so it's our job to raise people's vision to these kind of books that we discover and expose people to the concepts of those. And that way it gets people to start thinking. And if they want to think more deeply about it, well, they can go buy the books. I mean, I'm floored when I'm reading Vine's book on base empire. It's like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. And you're right about presidents like Eisenhower. I mean, Eisenhower, okay, you know, he gives this great farewell address, but that was at the tail end, the very last day of his administration. Let's not forget, he was the guy that authorized also the CIA to assassinate Castro. And if I'm not mistaken, he authorized the assassination of Trujillo too. I'm trying to think back to Mossadegh. Was it Eisenhower that approved the Mossadegh regime change? 53?
No, that would have been before him.
That would have been 53.
So if it was 53.
No, because Truman said no, and it was Eisenhower, I think, that approved it in 53.
Right. Okay, so it must have been just as the presidencies were changing. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, he wasn't any great winner. Now, and I want to emphasize the point that we're talking about here, because I want to make it real clear what I'm saying about this earlier thing. I mean, you bring up this idea of a treaty with Japan. Okay, let's say there's a defense treaty with Japan. Now, you and I would oppose these entangling alliances. George Washington opposed them. Thomas Jefferson opposed them. Let's just, if there's going to be a war, let it be called at that point instead of having these alliances. But imagine if you enter into a treaty with Japan and U.S. officials say, well, we've decided to add Thailand to this. Well, I would consider that illegitimate. You need to go back to Congress and say, well, now, does Congress approve of this treaty with Thailand? That's my point about NATO. Now, I don't know what the exact language of NATO is. I assume that, well, there's no doubt they're saying that the language that sets up NATO entitles them to gobble up whatever country they want, when clearly the intent.
If I can just interrupt you, I'm just trying to be fair and balanced here. It doesn't say our purpose is to gobble up countries. What it does say is that the NATO organization is open to the acceptance of new members who apply for membership based upon unanimous consent by all the existing members.
Yeah, okay. This is what I'm saying is illegitimate, that Congress should never have authorized that kind of language. And at some point, they should have repealed it, amended it, gotten out of there. Because in order, as I said earlier, that since this treaty obligates the U.S. to automatically come to the defense of these countries, then it ought to be Congress making the call on each country that comes in. And Congress ought to be saying, no, we don't want the American people to be pledging the lives of their young people in the defense of Latvia. So we're going to deny admission to this organization. We're going to deny that the U.S. is going to come automatically to Latvia's defense. That's the illegitimate portion of this treaty. That it's, in other words, and you alluded to this, it's an illegitimate delegation of power because of the way it operates. It gives the Pentagon essentially carte blanche to pledge the lives of American young people to any country that they decide, rather than specifically Congress making that call.
Yeah, I would just say is that, the United States government, as well as a number of other Western European governments, have been transferring a huge amount of military material to the Ukrainian government. And sending military personnel over there for training purposes. Admittedly, not in great numbers, but several hundreds. Under what authorization of the defense budget has the Pentagon and the president had the authority to send over at taxpayers' expense all of this war material to the Ukrainian government? I mean, I would presume that there is nothing in the defense budget's wording, the bill, right? Because again, the budget has to be renewed every year. That gives sufficient authority or open-ended authority to say that you can give unlimited military hardware to other countries designated as deserving by the president or the Joint Chiefs of Staff in conjunction with the president.
That's a great point. And not only that, Richard, but look how they're playing with fire here. I mean, the Pentagon and the CIA got us really close to a nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The only reason that the Soviets put those missiles there was because they knew that the Pentagon and the CIA were pressuring President Kennedy to invade Cuba. And they put those missiles in there for deterrence, for defense. And Kennedy ends up striking a deal where he says, okay, we won't invade. And they said, okay, then we'll take our missiles home. I mean, Kennedy had this unique ability to put himself in the shoes of his enemy and try to figure out why he was doing what he was doing, and then trying to come up with a solution. And when the Soviets said, hey, you've got your missiles over here pointed at us in Turkey, well, what are you objecting about? And Kennedy said, oh, Kennedy didn't even realize it. And so he saw the logic of the situation. All right, so he secretly agreed to pull the U.S. missiles out of Turkey. He did that. He fulfilled his promise. 6 months later, took them out, much to the chagrin of the Pentagon that was furious with his resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But because the Pentagon and the CIA were willing to risk nuclear war at that point. They were pressuring Kennedy to bomb and invade Cuba. They didn't know that the Soviet commanders on the ground had fully armed nuclear missiles, battlefield-ready missiles. All they had to do was get the approval of Khrushchev to use them. But they were willing to risk nuclear war here. In fact, back in the in the 50s, some of them were even calling for nuclear war with the Soviets because we had so much nuclear superiority. Their idea was, okay, so we lose 70 million Americans, we wipe all of them out, we win. So here they are playing these games, these maneuverings and so forth with a nuclear power. You never know when things can get out of hand. You know, we're so accustomed to everybody following rules of logic and rationality, but as we learned in World War I, sometimes things can go out of control, and it's just nothing to play around with. And it seems to me that that's what they're doing here, and something could easily go awry, and that's why you should never play these games with a nuclear power.
If I can just add one other thing. You know, one watches the news and listens to Joe Biden's rhetoric and those who are publicly speaking on behalf of the administration, such as the Secretary of State, some Pentagon representatives. What is their mindset about this? You know, what do they think they're doing? And if you listen to their rhetoric, they're fighting Hitler in the 1930s before the start of the Second World War. As far as they're concerned, Putin is like Hitler when Hitler was allowed to take the Sudetenland. Oh, he wants to conquer the world. We made the mistake at the Munich conference to give him the Sudetenland. And then he grabbed the rest of Czechoslovakia. And then after Czechoslovakia, he invaded Poland. If only we had acted earlier, Hitler could have been stopped and World War II in Europe would never have occurred. Oh, Putin is Hitler. We have to prevent the repeat of the Munich mistake and the breaking out of World War II by being tough and holding him off. We're rewriting the history that we can't live through again. This is their mindset. They think they're doing all in their power not to make the same mistakes of how Britain and France dealt with Hitler before the invasion of Poland.
I couldn't agree with you more. And it you know, the fallacy in their whole little gamesmanship they're playing is that Putin's made it very clear. If Ukraine is not made a member of Ukraine of NATO, Russia's troops will withdraw. Crisis will be over. So all the NATO has to do is just agree not to admit Ukraine. And of course, from my standpoint, the best thing that could ever happen is the U.S. get out of NATO, and which of course would cause the organizations to fall apart. It's a Cold War dinosaur. It's just causing problems for the people of the world, and especially people here in the United States. Anyway, Richard, we're out of time. So on that note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for your support. Again, if you're new to FFF, come to visit us at fff.org, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or to our FFF Daily, and to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. And Richard, enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Until next time.